Technology. All right, folks, welcome. It is really lovely to have you all here on what is starting to feel like spring here in Boston, but as I know, not the case everywhere else where you find folks are from. I am really excited to talk today about participatory planning and thinking about how we approach participatory planning in a way that really gets us to the outcomes that we want. And so I'm going to talk more about that in a second. This is part of a monthly webinar series, is maybe too strong of a word, but a monthly webinar project I'm running that I've recently renamed to It's Always the People, because my work as a practitioner is really rooted in the human experience of nonprofit life and how we can work with the people in our organizational systems to both advance our impact as organizations, but also make the work joyful and sustainable and impactful. And so if you enjoy today's conversation and you want to stick around for other conversations like this, I have a newsletter where I send out monthly where I just say, like, here's what I'm talking about this week. And so I'll include a link at the end if you want to be part of that. My name is Julia. I use she, series pronouns. I am an organizational development practitioner who has spent my entire almost 20-year career now in the nonprofit sector. And these days I focus on what I call kind of centering the human experience in organizational life. And I do that through people-centered organizational transformation and participatory strategy development. And so that's kind of the work I do day to day under my practice, people-centered change. Today, what I'm hoping we can do together is talk a little bit about what I sometimes see in my practice is like an all or nothing approach to participation. So often when I work with folks that are trying to build participation into their nonprofits, they get stuck in this place of like, well, if I make it participatory, we've got to throw the doors open and everybody's involved and it becomes a little bit of a circus. And like, do we have the time and process and structure for that? And I actually think there are ways to think about participatory process that still gets you a really inclusive, strong outcome, but has helpful guardrails to also make it focused and practical. And so that's what I'm hoping to talk about today. So in service of that, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about why I think it often defaults to that kind of all or nothing mode. And then I'm going to break apart participatory planning into two kind of buckets, thinking about both who's in the room, but also how decisions are made as a way to design participatory process. And then we'll have some time toward the end to think through how to use this framework, maybe on a participatory process that you are thinking about or grappling with right now. So that's the, oh, and I didn't click, sorry. So that's the plan for today. Any questions from anyone before I get rolling? Cool, okay. So I wanted to start with some of at least what I've seen in terms of where I think some of these planning processes can go a little bit sideways. And one of the things that I've seen is what I experience or describe as like the all or nothing default. So as someone who really deeply believes in the value of participation, I'm often in the situation of talking to a leader and pitching a participatory process. And the reaction I typically get is like, you know, we can't involve everyone. It takes too much time or too many resources to involve everyone. We don't think we're going to get the responses that we really need. Are people really going to have enough information to participate? Are they at the right level to participate? Are we going to make them too nervous? And so there's a lot of anxiety around what feels like opening up the doors. And I kind of experience that as an all or nothing. Either we have a small group of people who make the decision and then roll it out. So that kind of like behind closed doors kind of, which is never, I think, the intent, never the purpose. I don't think any leaders I've ever met are like, oh, we want to have like a secret meeting and make secret decisions. No, we're all just trying our best here. But what it can feel like are secret, mysterious things happening behind a closed door, that ends up being one end of the spectrum. And then sometimes what I see in client systems is the other end of the spectrum where we're like, okay, we're going to have it be participatory. it's going to be an open process. Everybody's involved, and that can get really frustrating and that can get really overwhelming. And sometimes you end up with a mismatch around what people think their contributions are going toward versus what's actually able to happen. Or maybe you end up spiraling a lot because it's really hard to get to the group to come to a place of consensus. And so in these situations, I feel like I often see leaders defaulting to the more closed door method, not because I don't want to be participatory, but because the alternative feels like too big, too complicated, too overwhelming. So I want to just pause there and say, does that resonate for anyone? Does that mirror experiences maybe you've had in your organization, or maybe even some of how you feel in your gut, maybe? Yeah, thanks, Maya. And having been in a lot of processes that look like that giant room full of chaos, like I think that's a particular layer of hell. So like I can understand wanting to avoid that. I think as a result of this all or nothing dynamic, and a couple of you talked about trust, I think both of these ends of the spectrum can be challenging when it comes to building, nurturing, and sustaining trust between different levels of an organization. And I think that there are three kind of failures that tend to roll out from this binary choice, at least again, in what I see as a practitioner. One of those is what I call like the exclusion as protection. And I feel like I saw a lot of that during COVID. I saw a lot of that certainly since Trump's second presidency, where the conversation has been, oh, we've got these really big critical decisions to make, but we don't want to worry anyone. We don't want to scare anyone. We don't want to overload anyone. And so we're going to keep the decision group really small. We're going to keep the information really tight just because like we don't want to freak anybody out. And so I think this comes from a really good place. It comes from a place of compassion. It comes from a place of empathy. It comes from a place of care. But it means that we're making these really critical, high stakes decisions without the benefit of multiple vantage points, without the benefit of really understanding how this is going to land on different folks within our organizations. I also see kind of on the flip side of this, what I would characterize as like participation without backing, where staff are given permission to like, oh, if you want to form a committee or if you want to do a thing or if you want to go and talk to people and see what they want, sure, go for it. But there isn't clarity around, okay, how is that process going to lead into a decision? And who's making that decision? Who holds that authority or power? So you end up with folks participating in something and maybe getting really excited about something that they think is a great idea, and then it doesn't actually go anywhere, or it doesn't stick, or maybe it just kind of falls into a black hole. And then there can be loss of trust there too, because it's like, oh, we thought we were building something and maybe it was never real to begin with. And that's never the intention, I think. But without being really clear about where decisional authority sits, that's often how it can feel or land. And then the third thing I sometimes see, and I almost described it like this on the slide, but I didn't want to be too cheeky in writing, is almost what I would call like participation theater, where we invite a bunch of people in and we have this really open process and everybody shares their ideas. But at the end of the day, it's the same two or three people who are just making the decision. And that isn't named explicitly. And I think that's the key. There's nothing wrong with a couple people holding decisional authority. In fact, sometimes it's absolutely necessary. Where that gets tricky is if we set up a participatory process and that isn't clear. And so folks think, oh, I'm really part of a decision-making process when that's not actually happening. And so again, there we've got a gap between expectations and reality. And that's one of the things that I think can really erode trust. And I don't want to do any sort of like armchair diagnostics, Tara, but that can be one of the reasons why people don't want to participate in future processes. I'm not saying that's what's true for you, but if I've participated in something in the past and my ideas didn't go anywhere and the decision didn't stick and I never got any feedback in terms of what all our work was for, I have no real incentive to do that again. Like it was a bummer, it was a waste of my time. Why would I stick my neck out again if it's not real? So I want to pause again to say in the challenges that you named at the beginning of the session, or maybe the challenges that you were thinking about, does any of this feel familiar? Does any of this feel like maybe this is a flavor or this is an aspect of the challenge that you were facing or observing or living through? So I lay these out because, and again, a lot of what I try to share through these webinars is like, what's the stuff that I'm seeing and how do I think about it in case it's helpful for others who are living through the same things? And so these are some of the patterns I see. I'm hearing that there's some alignment with some of the patterns that you experience in your own work or maybe that you've lived through. And so with this as the foundation, I want to talk a little bit about how I think about designing for participation that helps to eliminate these kinds of dynamics and create both a more productive process, but also a process that really helps to build and sustain and nurture trust. So I'm going to head here. I asked those questions. So the first thing I want to say is that I think part of, in my experience, the root of those three failures comes down to the conflation of two things: decision-making authority and participation, or participation and power is the way I framed it on the slide. A participatory process includes two sets of things: who's in the room, how, why, at what stage. And we'll talk a little bit about how to make those choices in a second. And then who decides? Who actually holds the authority to say, this is what we're doing. No, I'm going to veto that. We haven't reached consensus, but I see a majority of opinions over here. And so that's what we're going to do. And often when we design participatory processes, what I see is that we treat these two decisions as the same decision. Oh, it's a participatory process. So we're making a decision based on consensus. Sometimes that can work, but depending on the size of the group, like consensus will just not come. Like it's just not possible. Or if it is possible, you have to put a lot of work in to surface disagreement and build alignment. And like that can take a really long time. And so when we conflate these two things, that's where we end up with these friction points, because we either have a lot of participation and not the right level of clarity around decision making, or we've got some assumptions about how decisions are being made. Oh, eventually the CEO is going to weigh in and she's going to decide, but that's not named explicitly. And people assume that because it's participatory, we're all part of the decision making process, not just the building process, if that makes sense. And to me, what's really important here is the idea of alignment and expectation management. I had a boss who was really good at coming up with great one-liners. And one thing he used to say that I love is that disappointment equals expectations minus reality. And I use that all the time now. And I think it's just so true. It's one thing to be part of a process where I know, okay, I'm going to give input at this stage, and then this group is going to evaluate that input, and then this person is going to decide. I might not love that, but I'm at least clear about how my input is being used and where power is held. If I don't have that expectation, if I'm stepping into a process where these things are conflated and it's not clear, it's likely that I'm going to face disappointment, because what I expect to happen is not going to be aligned with the reality of what actually happens. And that is genuinely frustrating. And that can be genuinely frustrating regardless of how well-intentioned the folks engaged in the process are. And then again, that's a piece that can erode trust, that can reduce interest in participating in future processes, that can erode leadership interest in doing that kind of work going forward. So it really kind of chips away at the participatory or collaborative culture in an organization over time, which I don't think any of us want. So from here, what I'm going to break down is how to think specifically about the question of participation, who should be in the room, and how to think specifically about the process of power and decision making and where that should be held. And then I'm going to combine those two concepts into a 2x2 matrix because everybody knows that consultants, we love our 2x2s. And so that's what I'm going to walk through in the next few slides. So if we recognize that the work of process design, you too, Dana, great, thank you. If we recognize that the work of process design, oh, go ahead, Raymond.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think these are two important areas, in trying to find that consensus or just at least having everybody sit at the table. It might be a small table too. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking also, you know, this is also a mindset shift because
Mm.
we come from different schools of thought and trainings and all these things, professional experiences. There's some other things that impact on even just when I show up, either in the process, what role am I playing? And I
Mm-hmm.
think some of it might also might require a mindset shift to really look at it and say, I might be like a participant in this one initiative that I'm a part of, but in another one, I might actually be a decision maker. So
Mm-hmm.
these things are like they are like in flux, you see.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so that's just one. And then the other piece was it also helps if say for management consultants, if they are leading this process or whoever is facilitating for these group planning processes to have like a clear understanding of what should come out of all of that. Um,
Mm. Like,
because
what's
you
the
might
outcome we're looking for?
because in the process, for example, in the process participation, we can weigh in until forever, on a particular issue.
That's
We
very
can
true.
weigh in today, we can weigh in tomorrow, but somebody having a clear understanding of when all that is done, what is it that we are looking for? Are we looking so that we can move everybody to understand the process? Are we moving so that we can have a concrete thing, whatever the case might be, but just somebody having a handle on that piece too.
Absolutely. Um, and as you're saying that, Raymond, the thing I'm thinking about is, to your point, this decision, this sort of way of thinking about participation and power, it should ideally exist within a thoughtful approach to how we think about doing the work, which means starting with the question of what does good look like? Like, what is the outcome that we're trying to move toward? How will we know we're there when we get there? Because to your point, without that, like, we could just live in a process forever, which, like, for some of us sounds great, but like I recognize that that gives some of us hives. Um, and so being clear about that, I think, is a necessary precursor to answering any of the questions I'm going to walk us through in terms of how do we decide who needs to be in the room and why. Thank you. So let me start by talking about participation, and thinking about how broad do we think participation needs to be for a given process. And so what I've got here are just some prompt questions to help think about that, to think about who should be in the room. And it might be that you're able to answer all four questions with the same couple of names, which means, oh, that's a pretty small group that needs to participate. You might find that each question leads to multiple names, in which case you're realizing, oh, this is a bigger process. It's going to be a lot more consultative. So the first question is, what factual information does a given decision or planning process need? So whose knowledge, expertise, functional perspective, or lived experience maybe is needed to get you to a good outcome, is needed to make sure that you're making a well-rounded, durable decision or process. The second question is who needs to connect what you're doing to the rest of the work of the organization. And that might either be a question about bridging across functional areas or teams. That might be bridging to budget, who can sign off on spending money to do whatever it is we decide to do, or if there's decisional authority that sits at a higher level of the organization, or someone higher in the organization has broader organizational context, but who can do that connecting work and making sure that you've got someone in your process who can do that. Then who does this decision affect? Who is going to be impacted by the process or the outcome of the process that we're working on? Meaning, an effect, meaning it is going to directly impact their day to day, meaning we're going to actually ask them to help implement it. They're going to be responsible for carrying it out or measuring success in some way. So who needs to be in the room because they kind of need to hold the outcome in one way or another. And we want them to hold that in a way that reflects like real ownership and understanding of what we're doing. And then finally, kind of as a catch-all, whose absence would be a blind spot? So if you answer the first three questions, you're like, okay, I have a good sense of who should be there. This last question is meant to test that and say, okay, is there a perspective that's important to this that I haven't thought about yet? Is there someone's lived experience or functional role that isn't reflected here that maybe they're not directly impacted, but either because of their knowledge or their expertise or their influence, that their perspective is really going to matter in having this work happen in a really good way. So again, this is just meant to help you think how big does the group need to be, and how do I think about who those people need to be? When you're thinking about a context where you've got a really high degree of folks who are interested in participating, this might help you to narrow it down and say, it's not going to make sense for us to have 30 people in this room, but if we're going to have 10 people in the room, let's make sure that they're the right 10 that are going to inform a really solid decision. If you're on the flip side of that challenge, Tara, to your earlier point, and you're having a really hard time recruiting anybody, answering these questions might help you think about how to target participation in a more focused way. So rather than necessarily doing an open call to say, hey, who wants to be part of this? You might be able to land on, okay, we need at least 2 people from the finance team. We're going to need someone who is part of HR who can sign off on this piece of the decision. And we know this is going to impact the programs team more than anybody else. So we've got to have at least one voice from there. And so now you can do targeted outreach and coaxing to get folks to join rather than having that blanket call, which might be a little bit easier and might give you more focus. So I want to, again, I'll just pause here for a second. Any reactions to these questions? Does it feel like there's anything missing here? If you kind of think about maybe a process you've been part of recently, and is there a part of how you think about participation that these questions don't highlight for you?
Julia, I'm thinking a little bit about what Raymond said earlier about friction with an individual's mindset, what your role is in the group.
Yeah.
But there's also the organizational mindset or organization culture that you may come against in terms of deciding who's going to participate. So you need to sometimes explain to leadership why you're excluding or including individuals or groups. I don't know if you have any thoughts on when there's that friction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because in my consulting work, I always work with project teams and like I do a lot of strategic planning. So there's always a strategic planning committee. And one of the questions that we often grapple with is like, we can only have so many people on the committee. Everybody wants to be involved. How do we communicate this decision in a way that feels fair and equitable and transparent? And for me, I think it comes down to feeling confident that you can openly articulate the decision-making process, openly articulate what was the thought process that went into this. And what I think is helpful about questions like these is it might help to force you away from like the usual suspects, right? Like every organization has the same group of folks that like get tapped for certain kinds of initiatives. And when people see them get pulled into the next initiative, it's like, yeah, okay, whatever. This is just like the same thing over and over again. But these questions force you to think about like, are those the right perspectives? Are those the right voices? And if this is what's guiding that selection process, ideally you're able to like say publicly, we chose these people and here are the really specific reasons why, because they carry this specific expertise, this specific lens, they need to carry the work forward, they need to sign off on the budget, whatever it is. Does that feel helpful?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other reactions to this or questions about what it would look like in practice to make a decision using these, or like make a decision about group participation using these prompts?
Hi, Julia. This is Dana again.
Hi.
I'm just thinking about my recent experience. I think just clarifying that the process may not be one-off, that it may be an ongoing kind of bi-monthly, monthly process, and you likely will address this later on. But again, do all of these four touch points need to be at the first meeting? And when do maybe all those people don't need to be at the first meeting, but they definitely need to be midway, or they
Yeah.
definitely need to be made in the 2 months prior. So there's time to change. So I'm interested in you addressing that aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I like about that question, Dana, too, is for me, a lot of the reduction in friction around this kind of stuff can come from being really explicit with people about plans and expectations. I think as nonprofit leaders, there are so many good reasons why we're always moving fast, right? We're like bouncing from one thing to the next, or doing our best on one thing, and then we're putting out another fire. And I think we all know that one of the things that can often get sort of pushed to the side in that sort of kind of pace of work intensity is communication and being really clear about here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's what you can expect. Dana, to your point, you folks don't need to be in this week's meeting, but we're going to meet again in 3 weeks and you really need to be there. That kind of communication is what reduces the like friction or angst or anxiety that can come from, hey, that process is deciding something about me and I'm not in it. Or I don't know how those folks were chosen for that. I'm never going to get chosen for something. Like all that stuff that can come up when we just don't know, when we don't have information. And so we're making assumptions because that's how our brains are designed, is to help us understand a narrative. And so they fill in the blanks when we don't know. But that can often lead to that friction. And I want to come back to what you're saying, Dana, when I get to the last slide here. So if part of what we're doing here is disentangling participation and power, this is one way you can think about participation. And here's how you can think about power and decisional authority. And so in any decision-making context, there are some factors that are going to push you toward a more concentrated decisional authority with fewer people involved. And then there are factors that are going to push you toward a more collaborative or a more participatory decision with more folks sharing that power. Before I walk through what's on my slide, I'm wondering if anyone has any quick reactions in terms of what some of those factors are for you or maybe at your organization that drive you toward more or less concentration of power. In terms of more concentrated, here are some of the factors that I think encourage us to make more concentrated or to concentrate decisional power around a given decision. So where the decision has clear individual or role-based accountability. So this decision sits squarely in someone's job description, meaning if we make it a broader decision, we're diluting their role and their authority, or there might be some kind of fiduciary, regulatory, or personnel reason why we need one person to hold accountability for that. That's a good reason to concentrate that decision. I kind of just alluded to this too, but where that decisional authority sits in one person or one function's mandate. So where it really makes sense for that team or that individual to make that decision because they're the only ones with that expertise. You've brought them on for that expertise, and widening that circle doesn't make a better decision. It actually dilutes the what do I want to say, the quality of the decision. And so keeping it focused within a function or a person might make sense for that reason. Certainly confidentiality constraints. So we think about some kinds of budgetary decisions, personnel and HR decisions, headcounts, structural calls, work with the board. There are lots of things in those spaces where it's just not appropriate. And so it makes sense to maintain a smaller pool of authority. And then I also think about decisions where the stakes are really high and irreversible or irreversible, where we get to make this decision once and then we're going to live with it for a really long time. And so that's a place where you might want a lot of input into that decision so that it's a really good decision, but it might make sense for just one or two people to hold the final say in terms of what we're going to do. So one thing I talk to leaders about all the time is it's perfectly acceptable to say, no, I want to make this decision, and I have really good reasons why I want to make this decision. There are lots of good reasons to concentrate decisional authority in organizational life. But there are also good reasons to think about how to distribute it. So if you have a decision that's cutting across multiple functions, so sort of the horizontal range or multiple levels of an organization, the vertical range, it might make sense to distribute the decisional authority. If the scope of impact is really the whole organization, it's going to impact everybody in a really significant way, and you want to make sure that you're really pushing yourselves to make the best decision, so maybe sharing that power is going to make sense. Oh, Priscilla, I'm seeing your comment. Pushes toward a smaller pool, time sensitivity, that's a great one, compliance or personnel related. I like the time sensitivity one. That's one I should actually add to this slide because making a decision with more than one person in the room takes more time. And so if you're under a really tight deadline and you've got to respond fast, it might not make sense. Back to what pushes toward more distribution, and Priscilla, maybe you're alluding to this, you just might have an organizational culture that is both expectant of collaborative solutions and is primed for it, meaning you have the systems and structures in place to enable that. Like you've done it before, you know how it works, you've got a process in place. And then the final thing for me is also thinking about how much we do now. Yeah, I bet that wasn't that way. I can imagine it took a lot of work to get to that place, and that's not a small achievement to have made. So for me, one of the biggest reasons to have a more distributed decision-making process is when the folks who are going to be directly impacted and are owning the implementation of the outcome really need to own that work. It can't just be something you assign them to do, but they really need to feel it in their bones and see the vision and see the plan, believe in the path. All that kind of stuff really comes from deep participation and shared power. So those are some reasons that can push us toward a more distributed decision-making model. So Priscilla, I really appreciate your contributions here. Any other reactions from folks? Anything I missed? Or Priscilla, anything you'd want to add?
I was just going to add that when we have had those occasions where we've had, we have a co-directorship. So when we've when we've had to make decisions as co-directors because of one or multiple of those factors, like it was always really important that afterwards we went back to people and explained what we decided and why, and
Yeah.
Provided that context. So.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece of this process, is that closing that loop at the end, especially if it's a highly participatory process and a tighter decision-making group, making sure that everybody whose voices went into the process know, here's where we landed, why, here's how your input impacted that, so that you know that this was of value, this was real, this wasn't participation theater. So thank you for that. Go ahead, Maya.
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of decisions that kind of fall on the more distributed side of things, and the way that you've outlined this, that have been made in a more concentrated way at my organization. And I definitely think that's led to a lot of the stuff that I talked about at the beginning of the call. So this is really helpful to see.
Nice. I'm glad that helps to give you some language for that. So as I made my consultant joke before, we love 2x2s. And so what I wanted to do was think about, how do you bring these pieces back together, not in a way that conflates them, because I think that's where we end up in trouble, but in a way that helps you decide, okay, for this process, how do I think about participation and decision making? And so, sorry, I just got too many little windows over here. So depending on how you respond to these previous prompts, this is a way to think about, okay, where does that land you? And then this could be a tool to even help you think about things more quickly. So if we've got scale of process participation as the x-axis, so like how wide, how broad is the group who's in the room sharing their knowledge, sharing their expertise, bringing their vantage point. And the y-axis is that last thing we just talked about, decisional authority distribution. Is it just one or two people? Is it a larger group that we're looking to build consensus around? Is it something in between? So if those are our axes, in the bottom left-hand decision, we have what I call informed decisions, where a decision maker or informed processes or decisions, where a decision maker, maybe a couple decision makers, just do the thing. They make the call because they don't need a bunch of people in the room, and it makes sense to consolidate decisional authority. And they just make sure that they're communicating outward, here's what we did and why, to the people who are impacted by it. So nice and neat and clean. A lot of like functional leadership decisions might sit in that bucket, where it's just like, yeah, the person that we hired to make that decision should make that decision. Moving along the x-axis in terms of participation, we have a split box here that could either be a consultative process or a true co-design process. In either case, we've got a broader scale of participation, where we've said we need more people in the room to contribute expertise, lived experience, to connect this work to the broader organization's mandate, and to make sure that we don't have any blind spots. In the lower right-hand corner is I did this backwards. I'm so sorry. I'm just realizing this in real time. The bottom right-hand corner should be consult, meaning we've got a bunch of people inputting their ideas to a single source of authority who's making the call. So it's a consultative process where that person is absorbing everything and then moving forward with a decision. In the upper left corner should be co-design, meaning we've got a lot of people in the room, but it's maybe more of a collaborative decision process where decisional authority is more distributed. So in either case, we're talking about a bigger room of participants. It's just one is a little bit more distributed in terms of power. One is a little bit less distributed in terms of power. I'll fix that in the version that I circulate. Then in the upper left-hand quadrant, we have a shared decision with a small group. So this is a decision that we've decided we actually do think it needs to be distributed. We need a bunch of people around the table in terms of making the decision itself, but we don't need a huge range of perspectives or areas of expertise to make it a good decision. So this might be like an executive team or a board level or like a working group type decision where it can be relatively small, it can be relatively nimble, but it doesn't make sense to have just one person hold that decision. And then finally, upper right quadrant is, I would say, the most complex to execute, but can also be the most powerful in terms of outcomes, which is a shared decision in a large group, where we've said not only do we need a whole bunch of people in the room to make a quality decision, but for a host of reasons, we actually think we need all those folks part of the actual decision-making authority bubble that actually hold that power. And this means that you need to have a really good framework for how you make collective decisions, which Priscilla, I'm sure your organization has put a lot of time and effort into thinking about how does that actually happen, because that's not easy work to do. So pausing here, aside from my error with consult co-design, to see how this lands as a way of thinking about, okay, is this a low participation, concentrated authority, high participation, concentrated authority, or vice versa? Does this feel like it's a useful framework to land on? What's coming up for you? One of the things I coach leaders on often is you can have this dynamic in organizations where folks who have not been in leadership roles before look at kind of the black box of the executive team and they're like, what kinds of secret things happen behind those doors? And you know that if you've been on an executive leadership team, there's nothing exciting happening there. It's just the same work we do every day, right? Balancing priorities, handling trade-offs, figuring out how to make things work. But if you've not been in that room, you don't have that context. And so it's easy to tell ourselves stories about what's happening in there, how decisions are made. What I like about any kind of framework like this is it makes that thinking explicit. So we don't need to come up with weird stories in our head about the secret things that are happening on the leadership team. Like they're just trying to make good decisions with the information they have, just like everybody. And then the other thing you said, Raymond, that I really like too, is this also helps people to think about, why am I in this room? What is it that I'm bringing? And that can shape how I think about my participation, how I prepare to participate, knowing that like, yeah, this is the role I'm here to play. I'm here to bring this expertise, or I'm here to connect this work to this other team over here, or I'm here because I'm going to have to implement this. So like, I need to really believe in it. And I think that helps us show up in participatory processes in a nice way.